5:45 a.m. every morning, Monday through Friday. He rises, flips the switch on the coffee pot in the kitchen, and then he lets the dogs outside. Going back into the kitchen after he showers, he pours 2 cups of coffee. One he takes back into the bedroom, and he puts it next to the bed for his wife, who will be getting up soon. The other he takes back with him to the living room, where he sits down with his Bible. He prepares his heart and his mind for the day ahead. He prays. When he can sit no more, he goes into his closet and he pulls on a white t-shirt. He straps on a Kevlar vest and steps into his uniform. His belt with his lifelines he takes special care to put on safely. Then his boots and his radio. He kisses his wife and his daughters. As he walks out the front door, they call to him, "Goodbye, I love you. Be careful." This is my father's experience every weekday morning. While he lives and works in a small town that is relatively safe with minimal crime, he has had bad days on the job. He has held a dying infant in his arms. He has uncovered the bodies in burnt ruins of homes, and he has stopped students from killing their classmates. As occurrences of fatal interactions between the police and the public have been widely broadcast in recent years, public outcry against police officers has become quite deafening. In a society that favors political correctness and respect for races and individuals, the personal perspectives of America's police officers has been treated largely as irrelevant, with little or no attention being given to the officers' side of many of these stories. This morning, we learned from Gavin about the importance of stories. With this in mind, let's look at Baltimore. The rioting that took place in Baltimore in April and May of 2015 echoes the riots of the 1960s. One of these riots took place on August 11, 1965 in Watts, California. In that case, 2 white police officers stopped Marquette Fry, an unemployed black man who was driving while intoxicated. According to H.W. Brands, the stop was legitimate. Fry had been drinking. In part because he had been drinking, he resisted arrest. And in part because unemployment was rampant in Watts, there were plenty of young men to cheer Fry's resistance. Today, such as then, perceptions of these encounters are biased largely towards the individuals that are being dealt with by the police force, which is seen as the whole. Stephanie Rawlings Blake, the mayor of Baltimore, said the following concerning the riots that followed the death of Freddie Gray, a black man who died after receiving a spinal cord injury while in police custody. "I knew immediately that this was something more than the depressingly common passing of another young man in a troubled old city." The blame for the riots in Baltimore has thus been heavily shifted to the police brutality that has existed in the city since the 1960s, from which City Council President Jack Young says that Baltimore has never recovered. He argues that Baltimore is struggling to produce an environment in which those often most victimized by the police can better their circumstances. What this does not take into account, however, is a personal perspective of the average police officer that lives and works and serves Baltimore. As the case of Freddie Gray shows, unfair and inexcusable behavior by police officers does happen, and it is not justified. The nature of that brutality, however, should only warrant that an explanation be given by those officers responsible for the crime. What's more, these instances of unjust brutality are not intended to represent the American police force as a whole. They are the exception, not the rule. Unfortunately, these exceptions have come to define the public's perception of law enforcement. In a study conducted by Cassandra Cheney and Ray B. Robertson, published in the Journal of African American Studies, there are 4 themes of responses to police officers. There's contempt for law enforcement, suspicion of law enforcement as agents of brutality, and respect for law enforcement. What this study revealed is that 20% of those involved fell into the theme of respect for law enforcement. That means that the other 80% of respondents were distributed among the other 3 themes that convey a negative view of police officers and their actions. With this in mind, let's look at the story of Darren Wilson, the officer involved in the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri on August 9, 2014. A personal account of this event from Wilson's perspective has proven incredibly difficult to find. In fact, the source of the greatest insight into his side of this event at all is his reported testimony to the grand jury on September 16, 2014, which can be accessed via Time magazine online. His personal retelling documents how Brown, who was confronted by Wilson to use the sidewalks since he was walking down the middle of the street, then trapped Wilson in his car, beat the officer, and attempted to pull Wilson's firearm to shoot the officer. After the gun got fired inside the vehicle, Brown fled, and Wilson pursued him. As Wilson gained on Brown, Brown turned to charge Wilson again. This is when Wilson reports having fired upon Brown. When asked why he did not get back into his police car to leave the scene after Brown had fled, he replied, "My thought is, I was still dealing with a threat in my car. You know, we're trained not to run away from a threat, to deal with a threat, and that is what I was doing. That never entered my mind to flee." Wilson was not found to be at fault with his decisions on the job that day, but he cannot speak on it now the way that supporters of Michael Brown are able to do. In the Anglican Theological Review, George Wayne Smith reflects that this much is sure. The life that Darren Wilson knew before August 9th and the life that he lives now are very different. He lives in hiding. Anecdotes tell of his appearing in public only in disguise. He resigned his position with the Ferguson police force immediately following the grand jury decision, and it is likely that he will never work in law enforcement again. Anguish and uncertainty await Officer Wilson, and it requires no stretch of the imagination to see that his is the mark of Cain. Now, Smith does not idealize Michael Brown in his article. He identifies him as an imperfect witness who should not be elevated to sainthood. However, he does sanctify the site at which Brown was killed, where thousands have expressed anger and outrage at the system that they see embodied in the form of Darren Wilson. But I wonder if these thousands of people know that just before Wilson had encountered Brown, Wilson had just left a home where a family needed help for their gravely sick child, and they needed an ambulance. I wonder if they know that Brown trapped Wilson in his car. I wonder if they've read about Michael Gunn shoving Wilson's own gun in his leg trying to shoot him. These questions are answered through writings such as Smith's, wherein Wilson is equated with the biblical murderer of Cain, and the answer is a resounding no. As I was working on the research for this project, I called my dad to ask him some questions about regulations he was under in his department, how life had changed for him as a police officer since the events in Ferguson, and things like that. He answered the phone after one ring. This was strange because it was Sunday and my dad doesn't normally work on Sundays. I could tell that something was wrong. He told me that he was in the middle of looking for a student who had been reported to be planning to shoot up the high school the following day. I could hear his heart breaking on the phone. And so all I could tell him was that I was sorry. Before he hung up, he told me, "Goodbye, baby girl, I love you." And like many, many times before, all I could whisper was, "Goodbye, I love you. Be careful."
Questions, comments?
They were able to find the student and stop him, which was good. My dad's actually had to deal with that situation several times. And that's another element of this topic that I wanted to explore that I unfortunately didn't have time or room to do. But it's something I'd like to look into further. Anna?
This may, I'm not sure how much we know of what place to, but would they possibly draw weapons if the person they were after or just investigating and not attempting to arrest drew a weapon?
You mean if the suspect in question by police officers drew a weapon?
If they were, yeah.
Yes. As my understanding is that my father has told me that as police officers, they are trained to match, if not outmatch, the suspect that they're in question because it is their job as police officers to take charge of the situation. So if, for instance, if when Wilson initially encountered Brown had pulled a weapon right away, Wilson would have drawn his weapon right away as well.
Kimmy, are you basically saying then that using this particular event in Missouri does not represent the system of abuse that the protesters are saying it does?
Correct.
Okay.
I
Go ahead.
I would say that people tend to take, what generally tends to happen is that situations such as this with Michael Brown and Darren Wilson tend to get taken, and if the entire story is not explored, if the entire story is not sought to be understood, then it can become to be defined by terms of exceptions of extreme cases of brutality that does exist. The case of Freddie Gray is not acceptable. That's not acceptable treatment for a person in police custody.
Okay, so let me key off of that statement then. So would you feel it would be more authentic, have more integrity, to have a different case that truly is an example of the kind of brutality that does exist in the system?
Perhaps, yeah. I can see that perspective.
So that exists quite a bit. If it is part of a system, then shouldn't there be many other examples to choose from?
Other than what?
The one that has ignited the fire in Missouri.
Yes, I like the one in Missouri because it's an issue where the officer followed every protocol in the book. And I like following that through because I spent several hours looking for what does Darren Wilson have to say about this, and the only place that I could find his words, his opinion, his perspective was in his actual trial. And that is a little heartbreaking to me because I talked to my dad about that a lot as well in the process of this project. And he says Ferguson has changed everything in the way that we do our jobs. He's afraid to do his job now. He's afraid to take the action that he has been trained to take because he doesn't know what repercussions may follow.
So linking your dad to this presentation, where is the supporting factor of what is, like, I was confused of where you were going as when you were calling your dad and he was dealing with the situation, how that was supposed to be supporting the follow-up of the protocol of how Wilson and I don't know the other guy's name was following the procedure.
What I wanted to do with bringing my dad into this presentation was to supply an officer's story. That's one of the things that I see lacking in the case of Darren Wilson and Michael Brown is Darren Wilson's story. So to contrast that, I wanted to provide an example of a story. This is my dad's routine. This is my dad's personal experience and perspective of this. This is what my dad goes through. This is a police officer's story that I'm aware of because it's very intricately related to my life, obviously. Whereas I know that a lot of people may not be as exposed to that kind of material or that kind of a story.
Are you saying that even though there's some cases of extreme brutality that is totally unacceptable, there are still good men like your father?
Yes, absolutely.
Very second question. How many different situations, since you said you researched for several hours, so I would be expecting that you would have seen more than one situation. How many different situations do you come across?
Situations of what
Like these
particularly?
police situations, more than just Wilson and this other guy. What is
More
it?
than Wilson and Brown?
Brown, yeah.
I mean, evidences of police brutality the one that pops into my mind recently is the officer who went viral for pulling the student out of her desk chair, the video of that. That's something I'd like to see more, and that's something I couldn't find a police officer perspective on. There are dozens and dozens of cases you have to look for them, because a lot of them don't go viral like this. It takes one case to go viral and represent the system as a whole, whereas there's so many other pieces to that one case in particular, as well as so many other stories that we don't even get to hear about.
So with that, I would feel that in certain cases, this one just happened to be like a good situation where everything was followed by protocol, but there's so many situations that have happened, like you already covered, that it's unacceptable. But in so many of those cases where something has gone wrong and people who just are oblivious to what's going on and don't actually do the research, they're just gonna stereotype the whole situation. That's
Right.
basically like saying like ISIS, which is going on, everyone's blaming every single Muslim in that
Right.
country. So how
Exactly,
can
that's
you,
a great parallel.
can you elaborate more on that then? Like how are you supposed to just make sure this one situation is like a good situation versus like how you can just stereotype all these other things when you have people who are cheering on someone who's resisting.
I think it
Because
goes,
they're really thinking all these other situations are so bad, every single cop is bad.
if I'm understanding your question correctly, I would say it comes down to an element of personal responsibility to, if we see something in the media, or we see something reported, and it's something related like this. I mean, there's biases that are present that aren't necessarily hard to pick up on. It's an element of personal responsibility to take the time and look, if you're going to formulate a strong opinion about it, then to sit down and to look at what's been written. What else has been written? You know, if it's from maybe a news source that has an obvious bias, like, okay, if it's from Fox, we think everyone can be clear on what Fox biases are, very conservative, very Republican. Maybe let's look at a different bias. Let's do that. And I don't want to sound like I'm just advocating that police officers are always correct. What I want to say is that their sides of the stories are often not told, but that doesn't mean we need to dismiss other sides of the story either. It's an entire story that needs to be heard and understood.
All right, thank you very much.